Hello and welcome. This is the fourth lecture in the series on environment and media. This lecture is on advocacy in environmental reporting, whether media should only give factual reports or play advocacy role with regard to environmental issues has been a subject of debate for decades now. It is important for us to know about the debate that has been going on advocacy role of media. Let us first look at what is advocacy. Advocacy is expressing support for a cause. This is a very simple definition of advocacy. Advocacy journalism is journalism of action that combines activism with professionalism. Advocacy in journalism is going beyond reporting and pushing a narrative and presenting a perspective. Reporting is focused on an issue or on some injustice that needs to be addressed. Advocacy journalists believe that journalism is a calling and they feel very passionate about it. They feel like doctors, soldiers, social workers, and teachers, they have obligation to serve the interest of the society, and hence they should follow some ethical standards. Advocacy is fact-based but supports a specific point of view on an issue. Journalists take positions and editorialize their reports. When a journalist wants an issue to be addressed, he consistently writes about it, questioning the status quo. The journalist's interest in an issue does not stop at only reporting about the issue, but it is carried on until it is taken to a logical end. Advocacy is campaigning for a cause. It pleads on behalf of those who want to build support for a cause. It takes a lot of dedication, commitment, and fearlessness. The goal of an advocacy journalist is to make this world a better place. He is not a passing bystander, but takes keen interest in what he sees and experiences. Media advocacy is aimed at engaging citizens and offering them a means through which they can solve problems. Advocacy journalists have the spirit and the interest in seeking a solution to problems. Advocacy is not widely practiced in mainstream journalism. It is more often found in the alternative media and special interest publications than in conventional and general interest publications. Even though advocacy journalism follows an agenda, there is an implicit suggestion of neutrality and fairness. With regard to certain issues, journalists take a position and editorialize their reports. While editorializing may be very subtle, in some newspapers it may be obvious. So that is some newspapers you don't see how editorializing is taking place, but in some other newspapers it is very, very obvious for you to see how editorializing is happening in the news reports. It is rarely visible in mainstream media because media corporations have over the years stabilized norms and routines that rarely give journalists the freedom to campaign for a cause. Many media professionals value routines so much that they have developed it into a kind of paradigm. A violation of such a paradigm is seen as violation of the principle of objectivity. Therefore, before we go further on advocacy, let us begin with objectivity, because advocacy is understood to be a rejection of objectivity. The concept of objectivity emerged during the 19th century as part of the intellectual movement. It is based on the positivist belief that it is possible to perceive and understand the external world through observation. Positivism believes that reality is external to the individual. It is understood that scientists and journalists are impartial observers of the events occurring around the world. Objectivity is reporting of events and statements that can be checked and are independent of interpretation. Objectivity stresses scientific detachment and separation of fact from value. Journalism is believed to be an empirical information gathering activity with reporters making a dispassionate observation of events that happen around the world. A scientific approach to news gathering and reporting means that journalists believe that through observation, the world can be perceived and interpreted. It also stresses that journalists act as neutral transmitters who pass along events to an audience. Objectivity demands that the reporters do not use emotional language or sensationalism or any strategy to elicit specific reactions from the audiences. Since facts are separated from opinions, the intrusion of opinion into a recitation of facts threatens objectivity. A reporter with strongly held values and opinions challenges the traditional system of journalistic practice. A journalist is expected to be value-free. News can and ought to be objective, balanced, and reflective of social reality. The ideal of objectivity rests on the assumption that the facts are ultimately knowable and the journalist is capable of transmitting a truthful account of what is out there in the external world. So objectivity is the golden rule of journalistic practice. It is something like Hippocratic oath that doctors take to uphold ethical standards. Adherence to objectivity supposedly gives respectability to journalists. They're supposed to go by the standard, accepted ethical norms, and that includes objectivity. Then let us look at the criticism of objectivity. It is not that everyone, believes that objectivity is the core value of journalism. They have their own opinions with regard to how valuable objectivity is. One of the major criticisms is that the ideal of objectivity denies freedom of interpretation and subjectivity to the journalist. A journalist is not allowed to say something on his own, but he has to state only the facts that he has gathered. If the subjectivity of the journalist is eliminated, then it means that the very personality of the journalist is lost. A journalist denies individuality to himself and becomes a transmitter of information. Objectivity alienates the journalist from the very product he produces. A factory worker is alienated from the product he produces. The press worker's own product is alienated by the technique of journalistic writing. On the one hand, he is denied recognition of himself in the product, and on the other, he is forced to act as an agent of the dominant forces in society. The word objectivity is used defensively by reporters as a strategic ritual for protecting themselves from mistakes as well as from their critics. They take no responsibility but to transfer it to the sources. So anything that they are saying has come from sources. So if there is something wrong going on, it is not them who are responsible, but the sources themselves. Objectivity is the consecration of an ideology and class interest as a universal value. Any description of reality as it is in fact imbued with ideological meaning. The receiver receives a reality which has already been given an interpretation. It is a conspiracy of the powerful social groups to hide truth. There is a selective penetration of reality and determination of what is important and what is not. The interpretation is that of the ruling class and its mode of false consciousness. Events are interpreted in terms of the dominant system of values. Interpretation is implicit in the selection itself. Journalists select some events and ignore others. Facts are cut off from their roots. The description of facts goes no further than the facts themselves. They are deprived of the conditions which would explain their occurrences. They are detached from the social system that endows them with meaning. Facts are what they are in themselves and not what journalists sees them to be. Readers become passive receivers. Objectivity prevents the reader from taking creative part in the world and obliges him to passively receive commodified news. Many journalists reject the objectivity of the mainstream press as a practical impossibility. They argue that complete objectivity is not possible. It is an unattainable goal. Even a photograph which is supposed to be the mirror of reality, is also ideological. Themes, frames, foreground, background, angle are all deliberately chosen. When you take a picture through a camera, you make all these decisions. A camera is also limited by its position. Photographs can also be given a color effect, a nuance by using a certain filter. You can change the color of the photograph. You can give a blue tinge or a red tinge to a photograph by using a filter. So then objectivity is like four blind men describing how an elephant looks. Objectivity is also not possible even for a robot because it is also designed by the intelligence of a man who has his own perspective and reasoning. News gatherers, news writers, editors, publishers have their own ideas. They have their own emotions, opinions, attitudes, and biases. And if news is filtered through all these biases, how can there be objectivity? That is the question. Unlike scientists who are guided by theories, journalists are guided by the reality they observe. Therefore, a phenomenon that journalists observe can be described differently or can even be disputed. Journalists of late have been using the terms like accuracy, balance, and fairness instead of the term reporting because they find the use of the term advocacy very problematic. Now let us look at environmental advocacy in media. Whether media should practice objectivity or play an advocacy role concerning environmental reporting has been a subject of debate for decades. There is no agreement among journalists themselves. While most media organizations want to address environmental problems through objective reporting, some of them have proclaimed themselves environmental advocates. They openly support environmental causes. They have no hesitation in saying that they are supporting a particular environmental cause. Advocacy helps media identify themselves with the communities they serve, but it may also antagonize advertisers. The media try to move cautiously on environmental issues and try to find balance between community's interest and the interest of the advertisers because they have to survive in the market. Advocacy is possible only when publishers, editors, and reporters are in agreement on what constitutes a serious issue. If only a reporter is interested in environmental issues, that is not enough. He needs time and resources to pursue environmental stories. If the editor thinks that the newspaper's job is to report and not to advocate, then advocacy won't happen. And if advocacy is coming in the way of his own business interest, no publisher will allow it. A publisher would not want advocacy reporting to question the business interest of the people who spend a lot of advertising money on his own newspaper. Objectivity in environmental reporting means that reporters often attempt to distance themselves and their readers from environmental issues. Reporters tend to take refuge in the objectivism of science. A journalist sees himself as a neutral voice that is willing to report on an environmental issue only when there is adequate and indisputable evidence. But very few reporters have the ability to understand how good the evidence is. One of the reasons why environmental issues attract media attention is that they can be presented in non-partisan terms even while fostering environmental protest subversively. Those who argue that journalists should take an active part in environmental protection say that reporting only what their sources say can effectively shift all their responsibility to their sources. It is believed that objectivity as a principle of reporting that encourages uncritical reporting of what officials and those in positions of power say. In this way, the individual biases of journalists are avoided, but institutional biases are reinforced. Objective reports represent society's dominant values, largely agreed upon by the government, commerce, and other institutions, including the media. A reporter who openly espouses a point of view on an issue is seen as violating the norms of journalistic practice. The public and media professionals have different perspectives on how the media should function in a society. While the public sees media in relation to profits, political influence, and sensationalism, the media professionals see them as impartial communicators who separate fact from opinion. Let us look at why advocacy in environmental reporting is needed. If advocacy is not there in reporting of other issues, why there should be advocacy in reporting only environmental issues? Some activists and scientists think that media are not doing enough in creating environmental awareness. They call upon media to abandon their traditions of objective reporting. They argue that journalists must become advocates if society is to prevent climate change, depletion of ozone layer, deforestation, soil erosion, degradation of oceans, and loss of biodiversity. Those who favor advocacy journalism argue that the time is running out and that one can't afford to wait for the audience to come to their own conclusions. Lester Brown, the founder of environmental research organization World Watch Institute, who stresses on the role of media in environmental education, says, I quote him, "We don't have time for traditional approach to we don't have time for traditional approach to education. There is no time for training new generations of teachers to train new generations of students. We don't have generations, we only have years. The communications industry is the only instrument that has the capacity to educate the public on the scale needed and in the time available. Advocacy is strongly recommended as the media have the ability to educate millions of people. Advocacy is considered as a means through which further damage to the environment can be prevented with a sense of urgency. Media are expected to understand the environmental catastrophe that is looming large and act immediately to move people to action. Now, let us look at some of the arguments against advocacy. Some journalists oppose advocacy in media. The founder president of the International Federation of Environmental Journalists, IFEJ, Tet Jin, argues that though the media coverage of environmental issues is often lacking, advocacy journalism is not an answer. He says, and I quote him, "I believe that advocacy journalism, if it means one-sided and unfair reporting, is misguided and in the long run, counterproductive. If major newspapers, magazines, and broadcast stations adopt an advocacy philosophy, the media will be treading on dangerous ground that could alienate readers and viewers and cause them to stop trusting the media. Journalists who have spent their careers establishing reputations for fairness and accuracy would suddenly find their credibility evaporating." This is what Det Jin says. As I said before, he was the founder president of International Federation of Environmental Journalists. Traditional approaches of media like investigative reporting, agenda setting, and mass education are preferred to advocacy. Research is more important than advocacy. Many journalists argue that media should pay more attention to research than to advocacy. It is through investigation and through continued writing that journalists can help bring attention to the problems. One should not scream or protest as a journalist. A journalist's responsibility is to investigate, write, and throw new light on environmental issues. Those who believe in advocacy tend to produce one-sided stories that do not include views of those who do not agree with them. It is important for journalists to maintain their tradition of healthy skepticism and question government, corporations, and even environmental groups. As a rule, journalists are expected to report all sides of an environmental controversy. There is an argument that advocacy is okay in specialized publications but not in mainstream newspapers. In specialized magazines like the Down to Earth, the coverage can be one-sided because it is brought out by an organization that is involved in advocacy. But professional values in journalism demand that there is balance in the story, in the sense that opposing voices are not excluded. Now let us look at the reporter, journalist, and activist. Is there any difference among them? Some journalists often talk about the difference between a journalist and a reporter. A journalist is an analytical creature, whereas a reporter only narrates what has happened. A reporter is one who reports a press conference as it is, but a journalist is one who moves from a formative stage into an analytical frame. As he moves into an analytical frame, he is expected not to accept information as it is, but test it himself and re-narrate it based on his own understanding and experiences. A reporter may be neutral about an environmental issue, but a journalist is one who puts forward his understanding and experiences. It's an argumentative position that can keep shifting in the context of changing realities. When a journalist goes beyond reporting, he is moving closer to advocacy. A journalist has to take a stand and argue his position because he has seen something happening. The audience want a journalist to argue and present a perspective. So the audience want journalists to present a perspective, not to simply present a series of facts. Activism is inbuilt into the practice of environmental journalists. Supporting an environmental cause is the responsibility of public-spirited journalists. Unlike a reporter, a journalist is one who makes all efforts to push the government and the people into action. During the freedom movement, there was nothing like a journalist being neither with the British nor with the Indians. It was a calling for the cause of the nation. So they brought out newspapers with a specific purpose, and they were advocating the cause of Indian freedom. In fact, both Gandhi and Nehru, and also Ambedkar, Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar brought out newspapers, which in many ways examples for advocacy journalism. They advocated a cause. So many freedom fighters were also journalists, and journalists were also freedom fighters. They were using newspapers to mobilize people to support the national movement to drive away the British. A journalist has to be biased towards the future of this planet. The fairness doctrine of giving equal importance to both sides of an issue will not be helpful in the case of environmental issues, because environmental issues require our immediate attention. Several journalists believe that activism is at the very core of environmental reporting. Environmental journalism always has an angle of advocacy. If a factory is releasing toxic effluents into a water body, it is important to say that the water is getting polluted and that it can lead to health hazards. Health hazards always outweigh economic benefits. The industrial lobby and the bureaucracy would not want the media to do the advocacy job. It is important for the journalist to be on the side of the truth. When it comes to the forest rights of the Adivasis, the media should highlight the rights of the tribes to have access to the resources of forest. If you take the issue of large dams, newspapers used to usually take a middle course with regard to the benefits and environmental consequences of large dams. But with the availability of indisputable evidence and large-scale destruction of the environment, some of them have abandoned the middle path. They advocate non-conventional ways to meet the needs of irrigation and power, and they have been clearly speaking against building large dams which displace lakhs of people and also cause ecological disaster by destroying ecosystems. Many environmental activists have become journalists, and journalists have become activists. For example, in the Uttar Kannada district of Karnataka, activists have become journalists and writers. They became journalists because they had discovered that the issues they were raising had not been properly reported in the newspapers. So the activists wanted certain aspect of the issues to be highlighted. So they decided that they must themselves explain the problems to the people. So many of them became journalists because their views were not properly being represented through mainstream media. And this happened during the Apiko movement in the early 1980s in Uttar Kannada district of Karnataka. So when they started writing, they began forcefully arguing against the projects that were detrimental to the ecology of the Western Ghats. They set the trend for advocacy journalism in the districts. So when activists became journalists, there was certainly advocacy in journalism. Some journalists also argue that they are first citizens and then they are journalists. In fact, they refer to Article 51G of the Indian Constitution. Article 51G of the Indian Constitution says that it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, and wildlife, and to have compassion for living creatures. They say it is everyone's duty to protect the resources of this country. So they actively get involved in some of the programs organized to promote better understanding of environmental problems. Many journalists have become members of civil society groups. India's well-known environmental journalist Daryl DeMonte, Daryl DeMonte passed away in 2019. And Daryl DeMonte was an advocate of citizens' involvement in caring for neighborhoods. He was the president of Bandra West Residents Association. He was a trustee of Mumbai Waterfront Center. He was also a member of Apna Mumbai Abhiyan. He was also the chair of the Celebrate Bandra Trust, and he was also a convener of Celebrate Bandra Festival. So through these organizations, he was actively involved in promoting and in protecting the interest of the community where he lived, that is in Mumbai. Like him, there are many environmental journalists who are actively involved in many civil society groups and in many environmental organizations. One of the ways to get people to act against environmental pollution is to provide them information about how to get involved. Providing that kind of information is known as mobilizing information, which is an indication of advocacy. Mobilizing information is information that allows people to act. The information may be about what to do, where to go, whom to contact, whom to send a petition to, etc. Mobilizing information helps environmental groups or citizens groups in appealing to readers to take part in their programs of environmental action. The frequency of appearance of mobilizing information is an indication of media support for a cause. So if there is more information of this kind, it is an indication that media are involved in advocacy. Of course, there is very little mobilizing information in the Indian media. Now let us look at advocacy in digital media. As I have already said in the beginning, digital media provide a massive space for environmental advocacy. More than any other medium, advocacy is taking place here in digital media. Activists and environmental groups involved in environmental advocacy have their own blogs and websites. They are also active on social media platforms. They put out information on their web pages and provide interactive contents too. The amount of information one can share on digital media is unlimited. Environmental NGOs, to a large extent, rely on their own dissemination strategies as they are often unable to reach people through the mainstream media. With the increased use of electronic media, NGOs feel that there is lesser scope for distortion or misrepresentation. Some of the online media are run through subscriptions and donations, because of which they enjoy greater freedom. Analytical reports on deforestation, mining, the threat to wildlife, and water pollution have appeared in the online media. However, online media do not enjoy the kind of credibility that mainstream newspapers enjoy. Credibility is important for advocacy, otherwise, net users will not believe what activist groups say on environmental issues. One of the major problems with using new media for advocacy is that they can be censored easily. There is a lot of censorship going on digital media front. Many activists have complained about their Facebook posts, Twitter messages, YouTube videos being taken off for allegedly posting objectionable materials. Even while using the internet, one has to consistently fight for the freedom of expression. Internet shutdowns have been happening frequently in recent years. This has become a major problem for NGOs, activists, and also for those journalists who work for digital media. In a real sense, no medium is free. Some environmentalists are of the view that online and social media are not of much use as tools of advocacy because they do not reach the people who need to be reached. They actually reach the same people who are already familiar with the issues that the organizations are talking about. As several recent surveys have shown, printed newspapers, irrespective of the quality of the content, are still seen as reliable sources of information and opinions. Therefore, activists and NGOs value the advocacy role of print media with regard to environmental issues. So the mainstream media have the responsibility of promoting environmental causes because environmental issues have to be addressed as soon as possible, and people should get involved in preventing environmental disasters. In this way, the media can play a very important role in motivating people to get involved in environmental action. That's why advocacy becomes important in environmental reporting. That's all about advocacy in environmental reporting. There are many other issues, but there is no time to discuss all that here. But there are some books and articles for references for reference here. I had mentioned this book before too. The book titled Media and the Environment, edited by Lame and Dennis. This book has several chapters written by environmental journalists. There's also one chapter which refers to advocacy in environmental journalism. And there is an article or an essay written by Guy Tuchman. It is titled Objectivity as a Strategic Ritual, an examination of newsmen's notion of objectivity. This article can be found in a book edited by Tumber. The title of the book is News, a Reader. And this article of Tuchman on objectivity introduces you to the basic arguments about objectivity in reporting. Then there is a book by Weiss covering the environment, how journalists work the green beat. This introduces you to several aspects of environmental reporting. Of course, there is a book by Sunita Narayan. Sunita Narayan is the editor of the Down to Earth magazine, which is brought out by Center for Science and Society in Delhi. This book is Conflicts of Interest, My Journey Through India's Green Movement. She talks about several movements that are happening in India. So this will give you a broad introduction to you with regard to what several organizations, several people are doing in their attempt to save environment from degradation. And that's all in this lecture. Thank you very much.